Hello. I would like to talk about Descartes and the mind-body problem. So, when we read through Descartes, the first two meditations, Descartes has a specific sort of method in mind. And he's trying to achieve something. And his method is what is referred to as skepticism. Specifically, it's what we often refer to as hyperbolic skepticism. Hyperbole, of course, meaning extreme exaggeration. So this would be exaggerated skepticism. Now, what he's after, presumably, is knowledge. He wants to know what we can know for certain. Are there things that we can know for certain through doubt? And so this is his method. He's going to doubt and doubt and doubt until presumably we can doubt no further, and then see if something comes out of that. So when we read his first meditation, he starts off, very first line, I have believed false things. So if we think of this as an argument, then this would become something like a premise. Premise one, I believe false things. I have believed false things. Now if we look at this, certainly this is true. This is part of what makes the transition from childhood, for example, into adulthood, is the desire to rid ourselves of false beliefs. And so it's no surprise, for example, that none of us believe that Santa Claus exists, for instance. Now, if that's the case, surely now it's still the case that we believe things that are not true. And if you say no to that proposition, then you would be admitting that you are a perfect believer, let's say. That nothing you believe is false. That you have accurate knowledge of whatever it is you believe. Now, aside from being a very grandiose claim, there's no reason to believe that that's true, given the types of mistakes that we make, and the mistakes we know we make, and so on. So nobody only believes true things, but presumably we would want to only believe true things. All right, he moves on. So having admitted that I've believed false things since I was a child, he moves on and says, how can I doubt certain things like these are my hands. So I certainly realize I've believed false things, but some things it seems are undoubtable, right? Like my hands. How do I doubt that I have hands, or how do I doubt that I'm here? Or certainly some things like mathematical propositions and so on. Certainly those things are true, and those things are not doubtable. And then, if you read a little closely, then he says something like, I'm maybe putting some words in his mouth, it amounts to the same thing. He says, unless I were, of course, insane. If I were insane, then these might not be my hands. I might just be imagining these. Or this might not be the room that I'm in. I might be strapped up somewhere in a gurney, foaming at the mouth in a fit of delirium. And I could just be imagining all of this stuff. Now ask yourself, is this or is this not a possibility? And again, if you say no, it's not a possibility, then you are presumably claiming to have enough knowledge of the world to know all possibilities in order to deny that this is a possibility. And of course, this is a grandiose claim. There's no reason to make that claim. There's certainly no reason to believe it. And so we must admit, given what experience we do have of the world, it's entirely possible that I am insane and I'm just dreaming all of this. Now, he says, but maybe things aren't so bad after all. And he says, because if you compare quote-unquote waking life, the life that presumably you and I are experiencing, with the life of an insane person, then there are some commonalities. There is a derivative base that we share. So, for example, take your waking life. And what do you experience? You experience other people. You experience hands and rooms and cats and dogs and so on. Now take your dreaming life and what you experience. Think of your most feared monster, for example. Right? Or some of the crazy things that you dream. Things like flying. Things like being pursued by a monster. Things like, aliens and so on. And when we compare the two, we realize that in an insane life, an insane person seems to think what is real are the things that you and I think of when we are dreaming. So why this is important for Descartes is because what the insane life and what the waking, real life have in common are dreams. And so maybe this isn't the room that you're really in, right? Or maybe these aren't your hands. But it doesn't necessarily mean you're insane. Although it's a possibility, Descartes' trying to block this and say what's more likely is that you're dreaming. And this becomes, if we think in terms of an argument, this becomes a premise. So premise 1 would be, again, I have believed false things. Premise 2, I might be insane. Premise 3, I might actually be dreaming. So he tries to block the idea that you might be insane, although still possible. He says it's more likely that you are dreaming. Now again, ask yourself, isn't this possible? Have you ever had a dream that was so real you couldn't tell the difference between what's real and what's the dream? Or maybe now there's these moments that you have where you ask yourself, did that happen? I remember this conversation. Did I have that conversation? Did I say this to that person? Did I experience this? Did I witness that? And I think if you're being honest, then all of us have those moments where you're not quite sure if something that's part of your memory actually happened. And so, or another aspect is, have you had those dreams that are so vivid that while you're having them, it's so real in fact that when you wake up, you still have those emotions. Maybe you got mad at someone in your dream and you woke up and you were still mad at them or something like that. And for Descartes then, this suggests that maybe rather than being insane, which is a possibility, maybe rather than being insane, really what's going on is you might be dreaming. It might just be a dream, a very vivid, lucid dream. So it figures his way into this argument. But then he tries to block that. So he keeps introducing these premises, these possibilities, and then he tries to block them and say, well, maybe not that, but maybe it's this, and it keeps getting worse and worse and worse. So he says, well, maybe you're not dreaming after all. Maybe what's going on. Let me say this differently. He tries to block the dreaming premise, and how does he do this? He says, well, look, take your waking life and take your dreaming life. What do you dream of? Think of your most fantastic monster. And what does it look like? It has a shape, and it's a familiar shape. Maybe it has a torso, a head, maybe some sort of appendages. Maybe it looks something like a squid or an octopus or some sort of something like that. Maybe it's a combination of both. Maybe it has a human torso or something like a human torso with octopus tentacles or something. Maybe it has a beak for a mouth. Maybe it has one eye or 90 eyes or something. But it has things that are familiar to you individually. So you recognize all of these things. It's just some conglomeration of them. And this is your monster. Or maybe it's just a big blob. Or maybe it's Dracula or a werewolf or maybe it's Satan or some demon or something, and it's got horns and so on. But they're all familiar to you. And they have shapes. Shapes you recognize. Squares and circles and triangles and things. And even if what you are dreaming, says Descartes, even if you did think of something novel, something you'd never seen before, you're still going to dream in color. Even if it's black and white, you're not going to think of a new color. We have that mapped out. So every part of your dream, for Descartes then, seems to be predicated off of waking life. That there's some symbiotic relationship between dreams and waking life. The life of reality, let's say. Then for Descartes, what this means is that even if you are dreaming, you've at least been awake, because dreaming is parasitic on waking life. And as all dreaming creatures, this would suggest that at some point you're going to wake. So maybe not all bad. Maybe not all bad. But he adds a fourth premise to this. And he imagines a possibility where maybe you're not dreaming. Maybe what's happening instead is some maximally powerful being is working to fool you in everything that you believe. Now, automatically we might think maybe this would be God, because God would certainly have the power. So if such a thing as God exists, the traditional O3 God, as it's sometimes referred to as, omnipotent, meaning all-powerful, omniscient, meaning all-knowing, and omnibenevolent, meaning desiring maximal goodness. The O3 God, omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, the classical God of the Western world, would certainly have the power to fool you about everything. So an omnipotent God could fool you that 1 + 1 is equal to 2. An omnipotent God could fool you that these are your hands, or that this is a room that you're in, and so on. But of course, a God worth worshiping, says Descartes, wouldn't do something like that. It's not part of God's nature, a good God, to fool you about your beliefs and knowledge. So Descartes says, well, okay, so it's not going to be God. But imagine rather some maximally powerful demon. An evil genius is what he says. An evil genius, an evil deceiver. Not necessarily Satan, just some maximally powerful being who's spending a lot of time and resources in fooling you. Now, block that. It seems to be at least logically possible. We can certainly at least imagine it to be possible. Now, we know how easily humans are fooled. I could fool you. Your neighbor could fool you. A car salesman can fool you. And so on. Imagine a maximally powerful being that's using its resources to fool you. Now, if that's possible, then everything around you, everything you know or think you know, could be entirely false. It's not to say it is false. That's not the argument. The argument is that it could be false. It is possible that everything you think is true is actually false. How do you block that proposition? Well, this is sort of a clever way. I'll talk about that in just a second. But what we have then is this really nice epistemological argument, this skeptical argument. I've believed false things. I might be insane. I might be dreaming. And I might be fooled by some evil deceiver about everything that I know. The conclusion then to this line of reasoning is that everything that I think I know is possibly false. So Descartes' getting at the foundations here. And if you read, he has that moment in the first meditations where he says, I don't need to take this thing apart brick by brick. I don't need to go belief by belief by belief. He says, if I raise the foundations, then everything goes. And he's doing this with our knowledge. So he tries to destroy everything we know in order to solidify a base. And at this point, he's just raised the building. He's leveling it. And he's going to see what follows from this. So we have this argument. I believe false things. I might be insane. I might be dreaming. God might be fooling me. Therefore, everything I claim to know might actually be false. But then he goes on. And he says, he has this great moment in the second meditation where he says, the meditations from yesterday have left me in such a disarray. And he compares it to being in a dark pool, right? And if you've ever been thrown into a pool, say as a child, it's a horrible, scary, crazy experience because you can't quite feel the bottom. You can't quite reach the top, and you're struggling. Now imagine that with your knowledge, your state of what you claim to know, and especially what you claim to know exists, and so on. This could be devastating to you. And he says, but even though it's entirely possible that everything you claim to know is actually false, were you convinced at any point that you did not exist? And the answer, of course, is no. Never crossed your mind. So you don't need your body. This might not be your body, right? This fleshy stuff. So that's possible. This flesh and blood might not actually be yours. It could be someone else's. You could be fooled that you even have a body. And yet, what are you not convinced of? You're not convinced that you don't exist. And so Descartes' way out of this, the foundation here is to recognize that even if I'm fooled about absolutely everything, one thing must be true, that I'm fooled. And you can't be fooled if you don't exist. Simple as that. And so in the meditations, you get the phrase, I am, I exist. Elsewhere in the Discourse on Method, which is a much more sort of rigorous scientific, philosophical piece, the meditations are a much more literary piece, but they roughly stem from the same set of ideas. In the Discourse on Method, Descartes says the famous phrase, cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. So he says, let the evil genius deceive me as he may, he cannot bring it about such that I don't exist. For every time that I think I exist, I must necessarily exist, because something must be there in order to do the thinking. So even though I'm deceived, I must still exist, because something must be there to be deceived. I think, therefore I am. So that phrase is actually a conclusion to a line of argument. It's actually a conclusion to an argument. And this is Descartes' foundation then. And from this foundation of I exist, I think, therefore I am, he wants to sort of build up his structure of knowledge. And so he continues, now that I know that I am, what am I? He asks. And this will come from the second meditation as well. And he says, well, I might want to say I'm a rational animal. But then he says, now I have to define what I mean by animal, what I mean by rational. And he says, from this one question of what am I, if I go this route with saying I'm a rational animal, then I multiply the number of questions now that I have to answer. And of course, that's sort of going in the wrong direction. This should be he thinks this should be simpler. And so he says, so I'm not going to go that route. Rather, let's ask what's sort of going on here, what this I is. He says, what did I consider myself before? He says, I considered myself before, and again, I'm sort of making this brief here, but if I can sort of get straight to what's going on. He says, I considered myself a thinking thing. I didn't consider myself to be body, because if I lose my arm, I'm still me. If I lose all my arms, my legs, I'm still me. If I lose my organs, I'm still me. And we can imagine a scientific era where we can replace all of our organs and so on. And I'm still me. So what am I? I'm a thinking thing. I'm a thing that plans, that organizes, that desires, that loves, that understands and learns and wills and obeys and so on and so on and so on. This is what I thought I was. And this is why I'm not body necessarily. So I am a thinking thing. So for Descartes, this I that I'm taught that we all talk about, that capital I, is thinking stuff. And it exists. Right? Because something must be there to be deceived. So to be deceived is a mental thing. And so mind exists for Descartes. In the Latin, it's called res cogitans. Thinking stuff. Quite literally, thinking stuff. But then he asks, so let's look at ordinary objects. He uses a ball of wax. And he says, take the ball of wax. And he says, what are its characteristics? Well, its characteristics are it's solid. It has an odor to it, right? It smells. It makes a sound when you touch it. It has a certain weight, a certain volume, and on and on. It has all these characteristics. Now, move it ever closer to a fire, and what happens? It begins to melt. Melt, 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 melt. Then as it melts, it changes its characteristics. It becomes lighter. Instead of cool to the touch, it becomes hot. The color changes. It becomes from opaque to translucent. It no longer has a specific shape. It's no longer round. It takes the shape of, say, the table or whatever it's in, and so on. So all of its characteristics change. And yet, something happens. You recognize that piece of wax. So solid wax, melted wax. From this it goes into this, right? Melted wax. But you recognize it as wax, and not just any wax. You recognize it as the same wax. The exact same piece of wax that was here. All of its characteristics has changed. It's changed its all physical characteristics. Maybe not at the micro level. It still has its atoms, but some of them have been given off because some of the atoms would have dispersed and so on. They would have separated as it gets warmer and so on. We would have changed maybe its electrical charges, its electrical makeup, maybe slightly. But nevertheless, to all appearances, its physical characteristics has changed, and yet your mind, the res cogitans, is tracking that change such that it recognizes that wax. Now, if your mind is real, if that's what's really going on, and the mind, the I, the thing that remains after all this skepticism, and it is tracking something, then presumably this change, what that something is change, and presumably this change is real. And so since what it is tracking isn't itself, it must be tracking something outside of the mind. And since minds are unperceivable, since you cannot perceive minds, they're imperceptible, then it must be physical stuff that the mind is tracking. So then for Descartes, the second thing that comes from this line of reasoning is res extensa, extended stuff, quite literally matter, stuff that takes up space. And so from this line of reasoning, what you get is two substances: thinking stuff and extended stuff, res cogitans and res extensa. And their primary characteristics are: res cogitans does not take up space and is thinking. Res extensa, its primary characteristics are: it takes up space and is non-thinking. And we call this substance dualism. And so Descartes posits two fundamental types of substances in the universe: thinking stuff that does not take up space, and stuff that takes up space that does not think. In other words, mind and body. All very well and good. For the most part, there's obviously some problems with all of this, but nevertheless, let's continue. So we have mind and body now. And through a correspondence with Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, Descartes is given a series of questions to respond to. And one of those questions simply asks, Princess Elizabeth asks, how is it that mind, which is essentially non-physical, how is it that mind can causally interact with body, which is essentially physical? How is it, in other words, if we can use another analogy, if we think of, say, like ghosts, what do we say about ghosts? We say ghosts are non-physical things. Ghosts go through walls, you can't contain them. And yet ghosts move things. So you might ask, how is it possible that a ghost, whose primary characteristic is that it does not take up space, it can go through a wall, how can a ghost go through a wall and yet move something? And this is Elizabeth's question. How is it that mind can control the body? My mind says, I want a beer. I want a piece of chocolate cake. I want something. And then there's my body. So how do my desires, which are mental states, control my body? And Descartes' answer is surprising. He says, somehow. Now he thinks it's in the brain where mind and body come together, in the pineal gland, that somehow they touch. Right in the middle, it's a weird little organ right in the middle of the brain. It was very mysterious a few hundred years ago. No one knew what it did. No one even suspected what it did. But this is where mind, non-physical stuff, and body, physical stuff came together. And he says somehow. That's his answer. Somehow. It just does. He failed to give a response to this. And this is what we now call the mind-body problem. It is a problem of the causal interaction between essentially physical stuff and essentially non-physical stuff. In the next video and in the coming readings, the readings for this week and for next week, this is what the readings focus on. It focuses on this problem, the mind-body interaction problem, the problem of mind and body. And we'll see various attempts at trying to reconcile this difference. And there'll be several attempts at this, each with their unique way of trying to get past this mind-body problem. And I think by the time we're done, we're going to see that talk about mind and mentality ends up in a really interesting place. That video will be posted shortly. I hope this helps. As always, doors open. Please come and see me, and we'll talk to each other later. Bye.